Hello, everybody. I would like to thank you all for coming to this year's Pforzheimer lecture, which, as the name probably suggests to you, is supported by a generous endowment from the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Foundation. My name is Aaron Pratt, and I work here at the Ransom Center as the Carl and Lily Pforzheimer Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts, and that means I'm the guy responsible for the center's pre-1700s stuff. I've only been here since the end of last May, so under a year, but I've been thinking about who I would invite for the 2018 lecture since I was offered the job. And thankfully, and I say this earnestly, which is not easy for me, the task of selecting a speaker was very easy. Sarah Werner was in many ways the obvious choice for this, and I was very glad that she said yes when I asked her to come to Austin, and sorry, of course, for the bad weather. There are plenty of book historians and bibliographers out there who can tell amazing stories about pre-modern books and manuscripts, and I'm sure to invite many of them to this stage in the years that come. But I wanted the first Pforzheimer lecture of my tenure here to provide us with an opportunity to think honestly and critical, not just about what we study, but how we study it, how it is that we usually access and work with the early books and manuscripts in the 21st century. I spend a good chunk of my life as an educator arguing that there is ultimately no substitute for working with old books in person, and I do so in good faith, I think. But the fact is that I, like pretty much every student and scholar today, spend as much of my time working with digital images of artifacts as I do artifacts themselves, and I work at the Ransom Center, where I can pull up old books at pretty much any time. Also, like most scholars, I used to take digitization for granted. I direct my web browser to a database my university subscribed to, and that'd be that. I'd be researching old books. In just a moment, though, Sarah is going to help us ensure that any taking for granted be firmly in the past tense for everybody in this room or watching online, I hope. Having seen a preview of her PowerPoint, I feel confident that she's going to help us all defamiliarize digitization as a practice. One result, I suspect, will be to remind us that digital facsimiles are themselves objects created and managed by humans with their own interests and assumptions, that they're not the transparent representations of books that they often purport to be. When you work with a digital facsimile, you're studying a digital facsimile, and Sarah's going to show us just how messy that can be, how much of a different animal a facsimile can be than an early printed book. Sarah comes to us as a book historian and digital media scholar based in Washington, D.C., and I've long known her, or at least known of her, from the work that she did as scholarly outreach coordinator and digital media strategist at the Folger Shakespeare Library. In particular, she was the editor and lead writer of the Folger's blog, The Collation, from 2011 to 2015. It was and continues to remain a model for the kind of accessible and rigorous public scholarship that collecting institutions can produce. Although actually, to say that I first encountered Sarah through the Folger would be a bit of a lie. As a matter of fact, I know her Folger work because I first encountered Sarah on Twitter, where she has long been one of the most important voices in the worlds of special collections and book history. Back in 2009, she launched her Twitter account under the name Winkin himself. And if there were any question about her rare book Bona Fides, I can dispel it now. Because when she first started the account, she used it to write jokes about early books in the voice of an early English printer, Winkin de Word, which gives her handle its name. And this alone, I think, justifies my decision to have invited her to give this lecture. And I would encourage you to look up her first tweet, posted in 14 May 2009, which I will spare Sarah from reading right now. And much more importantly, I would like to encourage you to peruse her account for the many helpful, insightful, and provocative tweets that have followed those initial jests under the persona of Winkin de Word. Sarah originally trained as a scholar of Shakespeare and theatrical performance at the University of Pennsylvania, where she earned her PhD. In 2001, she published an academic monograph, Shakespeare and Feminist Performance, Ideology on Stage, and she's kept a foot firmly in the world of performance scholarship, editing, for example, the 2010 anthology, New Directions for Renaissance Drama and Performance Studies. Among several essays on performance elsewhere, she has a forthcoming chapter to look for, Performance in Digital Editions of Shakespeare, in the Oxford Handbook of Shakespeare and Performance. And with this last publication, we see the merger of Sarah's background in performance in what has emerged in the last several years as a specialization in bibliography, book history, and digital media. She's given countless talks and shaped countless conversations on social media on these topics. And she's also written widely in more formal venues. To name just a few publications that qualify her for tonight's lecture, she's written Where Material Book Culture Meets Digital Humanities in the Journal of Digital Humanities, Digital Scholarship in Digital Studies, The State of the Discipline, which she co-authored with another digital humanities pioneer, Matthew Kirschenbaum, and published in Book History, and Digital First Folios, which appears in the recent Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare's First Folio. Finally, I'm personally quite excited to be able to tell you that Sarah has a new book coming out from Wiley within the next few months, Studying Early Printed Books, 1450 to 1800, a practical guide. It will also be accompanied by a free online resource populated with open source images, digital facsimiles, of early printed books, ones exemplifying material features that appear in those books. Please keep an eye out for it. And I dare hazard, and this is big, I dare hazard the prediction that it will quickly come to serve in both undergraduate and graduate classrooms as a useful replacement for Philip Gaskell's venerable A New Introduction to Bibliography, which has long been the go-to guide in teaching for book history. And with that bold claim, and most of you probably won't think it's a bold claim, but it is. With that bold claim, I'd like to hand things over to Sarah, who, again, will be talking to us about early digital facsimiles. Welcome.
I can't believe Aaron went back and, read through all of those early horrible jokes I made as Winkin de Word and printed, but if you like really bad printing jokes. I want to start off by thanking everyone at the Harry Ransom Center for hospitality, especially Danielle, who's been really wonderful in getting me settled in here, and especially Aaron for the invitation and for the conversations that we've been having over the past years as we've gotten to know each other. So today's talk, I want to use this opportunity to play with the idea of facsimile and to see if looking at why and how we make them helps us understand how digital ones work. So to give you a quick sense of what's going to be coming up ahead, after a quick history of technologies, I'll take you through my favorite facsimile, because of course everyone has a favorite facsimile, right? Maybe by the end of this evening you will too. And then I'll see if we can successfully defamiliarize ourselves from what we thought we already knew about the tools we work with all the time. So part one, a facsimile review, or maybe a review of facsimiles. One of the earliest technologies for making a facsimile of a printed book was the printing press. Joseph Smeaton's late 18th century type facsimile of the tragedy of Solomon and Persetia closely mirrored its late 16th century source in all of its details, with the slight addition of placing its imprint on the verso of the title page. It's a true facsimile following the spelling, punctuation, signature marks, catchwords, head pieces, initial letters. In fact, it's so accurate that this edition is notorious for having been frequently mistaken, even by kid experts, for the original, especially since many copies have had their Smeaton imprint trimmed off. As you might remember from the last slide, it's really tiny down close at the bottom. This isn't to say that this book was made with the intention to deceive. A.T. Haven argues, logically, I think, that when this edition was first printed, 200 years after the first edition, there were still 16th century books in circulation. 18th and 19th century readers would easily be able to intuit the difference between a contemporary book and an old one. But as both books became increasingly distant in time from us, we lose that second sense of knowing what they ought to look like, and the granular differences between the two disappear. Type facsimiles continue on through the mid-20th century, although even by the late 1800s, they start to look less convincing, less like facsimiles and more like imitations. There's still a lot to be said for their value however, for bringing forward aspects of the text that would go missing in an edition. Here, for instance, Stock, Elliot Stock, the editor of this, his facsimile keeps the catchwords for Easter wings that Randy McLeod uses to do so much with to question the order in which we read this opening. Is it one or is it two poems? Which order do we read the poems in? Do we start with the left or do we just start with the right? If you haven't read McLeod's Fiat Flux, which he did under the pseudonym Cloud, I think, or maybe Claude, he uses a lot of pseudonyms. It's a really delightful and convincing introduction to why unediting can be necessary and can be helpful for us understanding textual scholarship. So back to facsimile technology. These are sort of notorious. Another one is the old-fashioned pen and ink work. John Harris is the best known in that category today, although he primarily created single copies of pages, which were used to perfect books with that were missing leaves. So if you had an edition that you loved of the first folio and you were missing the last leaf and it just wasn't good enough, you might want to perfect it by inserting a facsimile of that leaf. It's worth admiring how very good he was at it. He was one of the best ones at it. That's probably not the specific copy that he copied, but that's one of the Folger ones, I think, down on the right, and that's him up on the left. It looks a lot like what he was copying. In fact, he was so good that he was asked to sign his works in order to help experts differentiate it from the real ones, and so he sometimes adopted the practice of adding his imprint to a tiny, unobtrusive place on the leaf. It's less about making his marks in order to ascertain that this is something different, as much as, if you can't tell it's something different, fine, I'll put my initials in it. Can you see how, right? Like, I've just shown you the bottom part of the page, and then I've blown that up a gazillion times to show you where his tiny little, I really love John Harris. So the practice of hand tracing, what Harris did, old books, could be combined with lithography to produce multiple copies of complete texts instead of just single pages. Ashby and Halliwell's series of quartos is one such example from the 1860s, 70s. Note that it's set up as its own book. It has its own title page with its own imprint statement on it for private circulation. You can see on the left. These were not cheap books, but were intended to appeal to bibliophiles. 50 copies were printed of each quarto, with 19 of those subsequently destroyed by Ashby and Halliwell, so this was really a limited edition. But I want to point out, too, at the same time that that's happening, its incredible faithfulness to the attributes of early print. Even the inked shoulders of the type on the title page of the original quarto have been reproduced. It's a pretty good facsimile, keeping all the features of the original version while adding in modern page numbers. The facsimile is decidedly its own book, as well as a copy of a book. At the same time that those line litho books were being done, photolithography was getting off the ground. There's a lot to be said about the connections between Shakespeare and photolithography and the Ordnance Survey, and I'm not going to say any of those things here, but I recommend that you read Alan Gailey's The Shakespearean Archive for that. It's really interesting the ways in which the Ordnance Survey, in order to prove this new technology, turned to old texts, and specifically to old Shakespeare. Photolithography made it possible to sell cheaper facsimiles than hand tracing did, in large part because the production of it was less painstaking. And really, the images it produced look a lot like how we expect facsimiles today to look. Photography started to change the game, although printing technologies to take advantage of it were a bit longer to fully catch up. Of course, the first document to have been photographed in facsimile and distributed was from Fox Talbot's Pencil of Nature. But those were photographs that were printed and then pasted into a book. It was not really a expedient method for reproducing entire books, right? But with lithography, I don't know, I guess maybe after the talk, I don't want to go into it now. You can ask me what the hell lithography is. Made it possible to print off versions of images in a more reasonable way. But with Stanton's photolitho facsimile of the first folio, a few years after this, and then the Griggs Furnival quarto facsimiles in the 1880s, which added modern line numbers and other apparatus to the facsimile pages. So you had the facsimile in the middle, and then you had it surrounded with the sort of textual apparatus that you needed to understand it. The use of photography changed what users expected a facsimile to look like and introduced a notion of scientific accuracy to such reproductions that may or may not have always been warranted. From a library perspective, a significant development was the rise of the photostat machine in the early decades of the 20th century. A library couldn't have its own photolitho printing press in-house, and I guess maybe it could have, but it wasn't really a reasonable thing to do. But a photostat machine made it possible for libraries to make their own facsimiles of their books, and then to circulate those to other libraries and to researchers. Here we're looking at an example of a facsimile of a title page, part of a collection of 74 such photostated title pages that accompanied the 1930 UT Austin doctoral thesis of Sarah Lewis Carroll Clapp on subscription books. So you have her thesis here at HRC and a copy over in another library, and this one is over in the main library, I guess. You could look at it if you wanted. Photostats are kind of curious because they keep the aura of authenticity, that sort of scientific reproduction that I was just talking about, even though what they print off are negative images. Those negatives could be turned into positives, of course, and they were circulated as such, but the negatives themselves were clearly of value, as here, even as you need to retrain your eyes to read some of the details. And I want to express my thanks to Hannah Alpert Abrams, who found this for me when we were talking about photostats, and whose own work on photostats and their implication in colonial and post-colonial circulation of documents in North America has been the source of my interest in this technology. There's been really interesting sort of material to learn from. So now we see a technology that some of us will have used pretty regularly. Not all of us, microfilm. From early in the 20th century, microforms were seen as a way of creating a universal library. A significant shift in how facsimiles were seen, from just copying and making available just a few especially rare or especially interesting and important books to something that can be used to copy everything. And there was another shift too. Starting in the 1930s and 1940s, microforms were often used, notoriously now, as a preservation tool, particularly for newspapers and materials threatened by the war. Eugene Powers started microfilming as University Microfilms International in 1938. And what we're looking at is the image that seems to be one of the first books that he ever imaged, probably earlier than 38. It was published in 38, but he probably took this a few years earlier than that. His company got a significant boost in 1941 when they were hired by the ACLS to film holdings in English libraries that might be damaged by bombings. So facsimiles weren't just about creating for bibliophiles their own copy of something that they couldn't get a hand on, but something that could preserve books for the future. Again, we don't need to sort of talk about how maybe that wasn't the best preservation technology, but as a way of thinking about what facsimiles can do for us, it's a real shift. Another big shift that microfilm brought about was that the form of a facsimile no longer shared the same material form as what it was copying. We've left reading books behind and have moved to reading spools of film. Microfilming continues. This is a grayscale version that shows the red and ink better than black and white does. And UMI continues to dominate the field of Anglo-American scholarship in its modern incarnation as ProQuest since about 1998. You are more likely now to encounter the UMI microfilms not in the form of microfilms, the way that I first encountered them, but as ProQuest's early English books online, EBO. EBO digitized the microfilm as a subscription database and released it in 1998. And 20 years on, it is nearly ubiquitous in early modern English scholarship. I literally don't know how my field would look if we didn't have access to EBO. And now we reach the stage of facsimiles we're in today, digitization. On the left is one of the earliest examples of a digital facsimile from New South Wales around 1998. You can still see this copy on the Internet Shakespeare Editions site, and it's worth looking at it, if only to note that in that version, the 1998 version, it's missing all of the blank pages. It gives you the front board, and then it jumps straight to the reader poem, and then it jumps to, like, this only makes sense to you, I realize, like, if you have memorized the preliminaries of the first folio, and I'm sure you all have, just like I have. There's no blank recto, you get the printed verso, you get the printed recto of, that famous portrait. It doesn't show you the blank verso on the back of that page, and it jumps straight to the dedicatory material as if it's printed straight on the back. It seems ridiculous today. Like, it's very disconcerting when you're working with it, but it's also a really good reminder that in digital years and digital technology, 1998 was ancient. It was a really long time ago. In 1998, the imaging itself wasn't cheap. Hosting the data wasn't cheap. The time it took for the images to download and appear on your screen took forever. In that situation, why would you spend the time and money on blank pages? Over on the left is the 2015, they just redid their whole Tempest, and on New South Wales' own site, you can see the newly imaged, and you can see, even aside from the fact that New South Wales has now actually digitized the end leaves and the blank pages inside the volume, you can see just from looking at the pictures how much the technology has improved in that time and the images that it's showing. So that was a quick review, but now I want to move on to my favorite facsimile, John Payne Collier's facsimile of the first quarto of Hamlet, which raises every possible question I could want to ask about technologies and desire and cultural context and how they connect to each other. Let me see if I can convince you. Let's start at the beginning of the story. In 1823, a copy of a previously unknown edition of Hamlet was found in a closet in a library, or maybe just in a closet, or maybe just in the library, in Barton Hall by Sir Henry Bunbury, bound together with a handful of other play quartos. It was, after passing through some dealers' hands, bought in 1825 by the Duke of Devonshire, who had it disbound, cropped even further than it had already been cropped, and inlaid so that it looks as you see here. It's now held at the Huntington, since Mr. Huntington bought it along with about 4,000 other books from Devonshire's library in 1914, a transaction that instantly vaulted his little private collection into one of the most important private collections of early English material in the world. Hamlet's really useful. Curiosity and excitement about this newly discovered and strange version of the play, and you guys all know that the first quarto of Hamlet is the one that people used to sometimes call the bad quarto, and I'm never going to call it that again. The text is really different in a lot of different sort of ways, and when it first came up, people were like, "Oh, what is this?" It struck a lot of excitement, and so almost immediately, an edition of it was published in 1825 as a type facsimile by Payne and Foss. That's what we're looking at now. And remember what I was saying about type facsimiles, and sometimes they look like the object and sometimes they don't. But in 1858, the Duke published, at the urging of his librarian, John Payne Collier, 40 copies of a lithographic facsimile of his quarto. The desire to publish a facsimile of Devonshire's copy came entirely from Collier's urging, who, we should note, was in 1858 embroiled in the controversy over whether the Perkins Folio's emendations were authentic or not. Second folio of Shakespeare's plays. He had found it in the Duke's library, had all these emendations, big, huge Shakespearean discovery. People said, "Oh, are you really sure about that, Collier?" The British Museum's experts in 1859 studied it and released a report that said resoundingly that it was fake. Modern scholars agree that it was fake, and there's a general consensus that that wasn't Collier's only forgery. So while this Hamlet stuff is happening is while his forgery stuff is starting to come to a head. It's just one of the many fun aspects of Hamlet, which is surrounded by stories that are almost too rich to be believed. I should point out that while I, like others, refer to this as Collier's facsimile, he, of course, didn't actually do any of the work. It was the Duke of Devonshire who paid for everything. It was Collier who perhaps did the little arrangements of it, but he doesn't credit in the book itself or in any of the inscriptions in which he added to most copies of the book that they circulated the name of his lithographer, Joseph Nethercleft. The book itself, in fact, doesn't provide any sort of imprint statement or introduction or cover note or anything for the book. It just begins with the image of the Q1 title page. In any case, unlike the earlier type facsimile of the text, this facsimile strove to represent the image of the playbook itself from start to finish. Only here's where we need to pause for more Hamlet aura. When the first Q1 was found by Bunbury in 1823, that was an odd Freudian moment, the playbook was missing its last leaf. Instead of ending with what we now know is the ending, it ended like this, with Hamlet's death and, thanks to the early modern printing practice of catchwords in which you repeat at the bottom of the page the first word that's going to come at the next page, that tantalizing stage direction, enter. Payne and Foss, for their introduction to the type facsimile, delightfully dismissed this missing ending as definitely not a problem. The last leaf is wanting, but as the play is perfect to the death of Hamlet, the loss is of comparatively little importance, with small importance. So where is Collier getting that final page from for his facsimile, which, as we saw, goes from beginning to end? Well, in 1856, a student at Trinity College, Dublin, sold a battered playbook to bookseller M.W. Rooney, a second copy of the first quarto of Hamlet, this time with its last leaf and the ending of the play intact. The travails of Rooney selling this copy at the price it deserved is its own story, but he eventually sold it to T&W Boone, who sold it to James Orchard Hallowell, who ended up changing his name to Hallowell Phillips at the behest of his father-in-law Phillips, so they blah, 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 who eventually sold it to the British Museum in 1858. There's a lot of really fun characters in the story. Rooney apparently first contacted the Duke of Devonshire to see if he wanted it, but he never got a reply, which is probably a good thing for spreading around literary wealth among libraries. In a delightful twist, this copy, the second one that was found, that had that missing last page, this copy is missing its first leaf, that is, the title page, making it a lovely complement to the Devonshire copy and the perfect way of explaining to students the concept of how an ideal copy might not actually exist, but we still produce a collation statement for it. That's a joke that will make sense to like 10 of you, and the rest of you someday when you take DeskBib will be like, ah, that was a good one. So you have two copies. Together they make one whole copy. We describe it as if there is this one perfect copy, but that doesn't. That's just in our imaginations, right? That doesn't actually exist in the real world. So Collier's facsimile is a facsimile of a copy that doesn't exist, that can only exist in facsimile. It's wish fulfillment. It's a book that's both there and not there. It's not only imaginary in that it joins together two different copies of the book, however. It also cleans up the copy that it's imagining. At one of the stages of the book's croppings, the headlines were badly trimmed, as you can see on the right-hand side. Well, if you're facing it, the left-hand side of the opening here. Collier's facsimile completes those headlines. So where in the Devonshire copy it says Hamlet, it properly says in the facsimile, the tragedy of Hamlet. It also cleans up other things like the grease splodges on the right. But those don't seem to be the only spots in the book that have been hand-touched. In fact, once I started looking at the Collier facsimile more closely, I started to see more evidence of handwork. And I'm not sure it is quite as faithful or accurate as some have wished it. Look at the F's in the top example and the long S's in the lower one. The original Devonshire is on the top and in the grayer text, and the Collier is in the yellower text on the bottom. I think if you look at the crossbar in the F in the Collier and of, that F is tilted to its side in a way in which the other one is not. Look at brass, Fortin brass of Norway. Those two long S's in the Collier are not parallel the way that they should be and that they are and then Devonshire. There are a lot of researchers who describe the Collier facsimile as a photolithograph, that is, a lithograph that was produced through photography, and they wanted to call it one of the first, if not the first, photolithographic book. Everything having to do with Shakespeare should be a first, right? This is the first photolithographic book. Although there is one prominent exception who describes Collier's facsimile as being done by hand tracing. Does it look like photographic replication? It's very hard to tell apart the different types of lithographic processes used in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Maybe what looks to me like tracing are actually signs of retouching photographs, something that was certainly a common practice. There's little discussion how this facsimile was made, either way. In part, this might be because there's apparently little documentation of it in Collier's papers. But Netherclift, the lithographer Collier used to print the facsimile, was known for making line lithos. And some of his most profitable work was lithographed facsimiles of autographs that he faithfully copied. On the other hand, an early announcement of the book describes it as having been, quote, transferred by photography to stone. Part of this confusion is because Collier describes it as lithographic himself, and perhaps scholars have substituted photolithography for lithography without really pausing to realize that they are not synonyms. And maybe we collectively, maybe we haven't really cared enough to investigate. What's been more important to us is that it's there. In a way, the answer to this problem is less illuminating than the confusion surrounding it. What matters tends to be what we're looking at more than how it was made. So, what are we looking at? What I've been describing to you as Collier's facsimile of the Devonshire quarto is, of course, actually a digitization of that facsimile. Everything that I've shown you up to this point has been a cleaned up digitization of the object that I've been discussing. I've just chosen deliberately to hold back on talking about them in that sense because I wanted you to process that information in the ways that felt most natural to you. But for our purposes now, this is a better representation of what we are discussing. This is what the Internet Archive digitization of the Collier facsimile held at the Boston Public Library looks like before it's been processed for ready consumption. You can see the stand, the cord running across the gutter, the light reflecting off the background on the lower left. These are views of the book that aren't particularly good for reading. There's too much area of the screen that's black. You have to keep turning the image around in different directions to be able to read the text. That glare is super annoying. And there are views that aren't normally available when you're using the IA book reader interface, which you're probably familiar with, and looks so easy, just like this. But they are in the batch of zipped tar files that you can download, and they're an important iteration of this facsimile. So let's go back and see what else we've really been looking at. Here we are at the Devonshire Huntington Q1, the image that I've shown you before, but now I'm showing it to you as I've downloaded it from the Shakespeare Quartos archive. I love the Shakespeare Quartos archive. I looked meaningfully at Jim, who spent a lot of time getting it up and going and all of that. It's not actually that different from what we've already seen, right? Note, however, the grayscale target and ruler on the left, the flat white background that the book is sort of floating on, the flat open book. Maybe, to my eye, the left side of the opening is slightly larger than the right side. A large part of looking at digital facsimiles is just looking for things that raise questions and noticing them, even if you never quite know the answer. This is actually a large part of just looking at old books, is just looking at them and looking for what jumps out. Same thing with digital facsimiles. I think I actually know what the answer is for this one, but we'll see. Here's the same book, obviously, on the Huntington's digital library. And this time, there are a lot of differences between this and the last image. Same book, right? Two different images. Or is it? The most obvious is that this is not a full opening. It's just a single page. This isn't unusual. In fact, not only is it not unusual, it's way more common to see a single page image than a full opening. You know why? You ever spent time in a reading room with rare books? Books do not want to open flat. Even modern books don't want to open flat. Do not try to open books flat. If you do it, you'll get kicked out of, rightfully so, the reading room, or maybe there'll be a really nice person at the desk who will go, and run over to you and say, don't do that, that damages the book. Books really want to maybe be at a 90-degree angle, but what do cameras want to take pictures of? They want to take pictures of a flat plane so that it is all equally in focus. So what do you do with a book that only opens at 90 degrees? You take pictures of pages, not of openings. You should also notice in this image the shadows being cast by the book. Definitely we didn't see shadows in the last image. Can you see them sort of down? We can see them on the left definitely, and up along the top, and weirdly also along the top of the target. There's a lot less processing in general happening with this image. As a side note, I've now switched my file citation, my slide citation convention, and I am now no longer citing for you information about what the book is. I'm now citing for you information about what the image is that you're seeing. So you've got the URL for the image, and then you've got the file name for the image. The file name for this image is title_page_p_1.jpg. It's a horrible file naming convention. Don't name your files this of rare books. The real question is whether the Huntington Digital Library images are the same ones that, processed and stitched together, are on the Quarto site. So is this really a different image from what we were just looking at? There's no clear indication, but my guess is that they are the same image. The HDL records indicate that they were imaged in September 2008. And just a quick aside to say it's unusual that they give the, it's probably because they're using Content DM, that they give the date in which the image was taken, because most digital image libraries don't provide that information. So these were imaged in September 2008, which is consistent, I think, with having been done for the Quarto site, which was being geared up around then. It is not too tricky to digitally stitch together two pages to make one opening. It would explain, too, why the left-hand side of the opening we saw looked larger. usually the boards and end papers of a binding they open more readily at a greater angle, especially when they've been rebound. If that board is open flatter, you're getting a slightly bigger picture of it because you can see further into the gutter. It might appear slightly larger when you're stitching it together. This is the part of things where I just like, because I see things that bother me and then I make up answers about it, and then at some point I go around and I try to prove my answers, and I haven't gotten to the proof part yet. But mostly what I think that makes me think that this is being imaged as part of that Quartos project is that if you have a one-of-a-kind book as fragile and important as this one, you are not going to keep imaging it repeatedly over the space of a couple of years. As an aside, just in case you were wondering what the last page of text looks like in the Huntington's copy, it looks like this. It's a facsimile of the BL text. I kind of love that it's there, but I also kind of really wish that the copy, I mean, this is what happened with Devonshire. He had a facsimile inserted in there, but I kind of wish the play just stopped. So here's what we see for that last opening of the Halliwell Phillips British Museum quarto is downloaded from the Quartos site. It looks exactly like what I showed you before, except for the ruler, color target, and gray background down at the bottom. The way that the book is floating on the white background is weird, is it not? It makes me think that the cradle has been masked out, or that at least the entire original background has. It's the same weird absent white as the Huntington copy showed when we looked at it from how it was downloaded from Shakespeare Quarto Archive, and I'm guessing it was a requirement of the Quartos project. I, again, did not actually verify any of this ahead of time. Maybe in the Q&A I can see if I can get an answer about that one. And here's that quarto from the British Library's own site. It's definitely the same image, only here it's been processed. And actually here you can see it has it's also not ideal, it has the exact same file name as this for this file as it did for the last file. I do think that if you look at the angle of the boards across the top, you can see that this book is not laying flat, right? You can see that there is an angle there. There's some sort of support either hidden just under the boards or digitally masked after the photo was taken. If it was the latter, then they must have also added in the shadows along the foot of the book. Do you see those? The lighting on this book is lovely, really. Look at how you can see the chain lines on the right-hand page. It's gorgeous. You can get a sense of the texture of the book, the way that in most of the images I have shown you so far, you cannot get a sense of the feel of that page. But it's just this funny combination of the strongly material presence of the book with textures and discolorations floating ethereally against an empty background. It's both real and not real, there and not there. And since we're looking at digital representations of the first quarto, we should look at one of the most popular sources of digital facsimiles, EBO. As EBO does with other significant incomplete works, but not all incomplete works, EBO has 2 copies of this text in a file so that you can have the sort of complete book. The first one was made at the British Library during the big mid-century microfilming push, and we have little fingers at the bottom of the screen. That's from a different opening, but you can see the white part of it. Somebody's holding that book open. The second copy on EBO was added to the collection around 1997, as far as I can tell. At least that's the date that ESTC, the English Short Title Catalog, has for the second book on this reel. There are no dates given for the imaging within EBO itself. You have to kind of find it on ESTC and then hope that ESTC gives you a date. I'm not completely sure how 1997 is consistent with my theory that you don't keep doing the same fragile book over and over again. But I would still guess that it was filmed maybe during some sort of conservation process, maybe during some sort of long process that was getting ready for them wanting to re-image it in the future. Maybe it was disbound as part of a conservation process because I'm seeing stitching, but I'm not seeing bindings in a lot of these images. These images are weird for microfilm since they're showing so much of the background. Anyway, it must have been at some point after this image was taken that the last leaf was replaced, because what the UMI film shows with that manuscript notation, this leaf is after a facsimile from the British Museum copy, is not on the facsimile leaf that's in there right now. We don't usually talk about EBO as having an ability to sort of capture the past. I mean, we think of it as showing us the past in the sense that it's showing us old books. But it also sometimes can capture moments in a book's life that get lost after conservation for us. So I'm not really sure when this was imaged and what was going on, and I haven't had a chance to ask to the Huntington what's going on. But I should note that according to Zach Lesser, the Huntington is hoping to bring out this impossible, completely impossible to ever see in real life copy in 2019 for the centennial of the library's opening. So if you, like me, find it kind of, I don't really fetishize seeing books in real life, but if that seems really thrilling to you, you might want to high on up to the Huntington see that. And I should also strongly recommend to you Zach Lesser's book, Hamlet After Q1, which is a delightful and smart read on the Quarto and all the implications it's had. So these facsimiles that we've just looked at, these objects in digital and paper forms, are each, in their own way, works of fiction. If not quite fiction, at least acts of desire that create an object to match their needs, or at least the perceived needs of their audience. We don't quite know what they are, or where they are, or how much we should trust them. They are, of course, not the only versions of Q1 out there. The 1981 Muir and Allen facsimile collection of Shakespeare's plays in quarto was what we all turned to when we were trying to find as close to an unmediated experience of the play's early texts, back when the only other options were microfilm or travel. And there are modern editions of the text that make it easy to read. And there's something about these books, the print facsimile even, that make them more real than the digital ones. Here's what I mean. There are only 2 print copies of this playtext in existence. They are, as you can imagine, and as they should be, closely held and rarely let into researchers' hands. Are you editing the play for a major publisher? Maybe you can see it. Are you just writing about the play? I don't think so. And yet, scholars do write about the first quarto of Hamlet, and they do quote from it. If they're using the Muir and Allen, or the 3-text Hamlet, or the Arden 3 version, they get one of those, all quotations from Q1 come from blah, 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 unless otherwise noted, sort of citations that we are familiar with. But if they're quoting from one of the digital facsimiles, it might get a citation, it might not. More often, it doesn't. In Shakespeare Quarterly, I've come across at least 3 articles in the last decade that appear, from how they're cited, to be quoting directly from Q1 itself. I haven't seen any that cite any of the digital facsimiles. This is not because they're citing from Q1. Where else do you get a source that is both there and not there? A text that reshapes itself before our very eyes so that we don't know what we're looking at. You can start to see, I hope, why this is about bun burying and why I love this facsimile so much. It has everything in it that we want it to. It's all about faking and desire. So let's move on and let's talk about digits and facsimiles. We've all seen images like these, and many of us love to trade them. I do too. There's something so delightful about seeing the hands caught in the action when you know that they are supposed to remain unseen. We all want to peek into secrets that are supposed to be secrets. And that's exactly what I want to call attention to now, how the manual labor of digitization gets erased from how we see and discuss digital facsimiles. We talk of what has been imaged, of the institution that owns the item imaged, sometimes of the company that did the imaging, but we don't often talk about the people that did the work of imaging. It's not only that we don't remember the anonymized labor, we don't remember that people are making choices every time a book is imaged. A digital image of a book is never something that happens by accident, but something that has been determined by a set of desires and priorities and their corollary results. This, for instance, is just a picture of a blank page. As you know, I love blank pages. And I really love this one. It conveys so much information when you start looking at it. There's bleed through from ink on the other side of the page. There's some offset ink, I think, in the middle there from the facing page where it says problems backwards. There's some water damage along the upper right, and there's foxing along the left. There's some sewing holes along the right edge. That gray border around it, that's me, actually. I put that up there because I realized the background of my slide was making it hard to see the white background of the book slide, was what I was about to say. But it looks like it's a pretty straightforward image of a blank page. Maybe there's not much else to note. But now what do you see? It's the same exact page, but look at all that extra information. The page has wrinkles. It has texture. It's possible to see the blind impression left from where the license to print the paradoxes wasn't inked. You can just underneath the line of text above the sort of the ruling, you can see that there's some sort of blind type happening there. You're just going to have to, this is, again, a Randy McLeod moment. You're going to have to go read Randy's article. That's the reason that we have this image. Randy McLeod was working when he was doing his research on bearing type, blind type, and how pages have a topography and they bite into the page. And he wanted a picture of this page, which is from a book that is owned at the Folger. And he said to the Folger's photography and digital imaging lab, I want a picture of this page, and I need a picture of it with raking light. That's why we have this image. The default is the picture next to it. Not all leaves are going to reveal something sensational under raking light. Not all of them are going to have blind type like that one did, or indentations from scratched underlining like the Dunn poems do here on the right. I don't know who ordered that one, but I'm sure it was the exact same thing. Somebody saw something and they asked specifically for that image. They're not all going to show dog ears like the one on the left. But think about the old books that you have handled. Are they flat and smooth? What sort of body and heft do those pages have? And ask yourself, why are objects lit the way they are? What uses are being prioritized? One obvious answer is that a flat page surface makes it easier to read the text on screen. It's evenly in focus. There's nothing to distract you from what it says. It's just words on the page. But it's not a thing that just happens. It's a choice, and it requires deliberate actions, like this plate of plexiglass laid over the page to hold it down. You don't normally see it, but on this one, from this image, they didn't quite line it up with the gutter, and so you can just catch from where I've blown it up that it's shifted aside, and you can see that there's something there holding it down flat. There's a whole lot of choices and deliberate actions that go into making an image that looks like it hasn't been made, that has just happened by itself. I want to pause for a moment to point out that all of these choices about how an image is digitized follow an even greater host of choices about what gets digitized. We are only very slowly switching to projects that coordinate imaging across institutions. In the first decades of digitization, it was mostly every library on its own, choosing items from its collection that it most wanted to put on its website. Anyone want to guess on how that went? there were a host of silos created, each featuring that institution's treasures. If you were lucky enough to own a first folio, that got imaged. A Gutenberg Bible, that got imaged. And now we have 22 first folios online and growing. It should be up to 50 in the next couple of years at least. And we have 25 Gutenbergs online. That number might hold steady since that's more than the complete number of copies that are surviving of that book. Meanwhile, the items that haven't been imaged are too many to count. Some of them are literary stars, like the first two editions of Philip Sidney's Astrophel and Stella. Some of them are historical and cultural firsts, like the captivity narrative John Morant, which became the first Black-authored text printed in North America. The form of Morant's narrative that has been shaped by a white transcriber has been imaged multiple times, but the authorized edition, in which Morant corrects and expands his story, has not. There are other examples, and the good news is that the ones I'm tracking, because I apparently track these things, they're slowly getting filled in. There's some early Aphra Bain up now, and the first American printing of Pilgrim's Progress will be up soon, thanks to the Boston Public Library. If you have things that aren't available as good open access images, you can add them to this list, and maybe a library will step forward to help. Pretty sure that's how Pilgrim's Progress got taken care of. But the bigger story is that what gets imaged and what doesn't is driven by human choices about what is worth imaging. And what are the criteria for being worth imaging? Repeated studies have shown that most institutions don't have a digitization strategy, so what worth is will be idiosyncratic, and potentially biased, as all human decisions are. For those in the field of early modern English studies who are familiar with EBO and its very 20th century goal of capturing everything, spoiler alert, it doesn't capture everything either, it can be hard to see how those human decisions have played out and what impact they have had on how we experience that database. One place to start is their notion of one text per record. Because UMI was based on Pollard and Redgrave's short title catalog, it works on an assumption of texts being discrete books. That is, just like each record is a text, put aside worrying about states, each text is a book. But what happens when there is more than one text in a book? One solution, like this one, is a blank piece of paper that covers over the end of the previous text, I guess to keep things nice and tidy for the record. Sometimes the first image will be of a single page when the rest of the work is of openings. I happen to like this example because the sheet of paper used to cover the left-hand side of the opening is larger than the book, and the automated cropping selected around the object's borders selected around this whole thing's borders instead of just around the size of the book. If you look up at the top, you can see how further the paper extends beyond the edges of the book itself. It's also this example from a sammelband that, according to EBO, is owned by the Harry Ransom Center. ESTC says that the copy here is the only extant one of this 1692 text. My quick look at the volume suggests that as a whole, it's pretty interesting. It's a collection of dialogues from Edinburgh physicians about, like who's a quack and who's not, and what's the valid way to treat a fever. And maybe tomorrow I'll look it up. But those of you who are here, maybe you should. This one looks like it'll be fun, and I think the rest of the images might not be in EBO or in Echo. In any case, let's get back to the point that every image is the result of decisions being made, and that every digital image is a digital file, not a book. That can be a really hard thing for us to remember. We look at images of books, and we are trained to see books, not the media file of that book. So let's spend a moment exploring what it means to think of these not as images of books, but as digital files. This should look familiar. It's an image of the Ransom Center's copy of the first folio that is online, and I downloaded it from the digital collections. This is actually a screenshot of that picture on my desktop because I wanted to show what it actually looks like when you are open it in IrfanView, which is the image viewing software I use. Because one way of seeing this is to say, oh, it's the Tempest, which, yeah, it is. But another way to see this is to say, oh, this is a 6.5 megabyte file that was saved on April 21st, 2017 at 10:40 in the morning, which it is. It's that second way of looking at this that I want to emphasize. There's a host of EXIF metadata accompanying this image of the Tempest that is also a representation of the image. It tells us what hardware took the image, what software was used, when it was shot, when I saved the file. It's one of the reasons I use IrfanView because it's free and it makes it really easy to see and to create image metadata. So this metadata can come in handy in a variety of ways. It tells me that the book was digitized in 2015, which gives me a cultural context to put it in. 2016 was, of course, the year of Shakespeare all across North America and the globe, and this, I assume, was clearly linked to that. It gives me an understanding of what tools were used to create this image, the Digibook Scanner and Adobe Photoshop. And were I really bad at my own file naming conventions, I try not to be, and if the center were bad at its file naming conventions, which it doesn't seem to be, and I had just saved this image on my desktop and didn't note where it came from, and if the center hadn't anticipated that issue by putting its name across the bottom of the image, preventing that, this metadata would tell me who created it. If I had questions about the colors of this image, remember the New South Wales, that really pink Tempest that I kind of love, which is now just a normal colored Tempest when they re-image their folios? If they had this metadata up, I could look at that information about the compression, the color correction, and the software used, and that could help me understand what I was seeing. Was the paper pink or was the image pink? Those are two entirely different things. Most digitized facsimiles, however, don't include image metadata when their images are downloaded. Out of the 22 currently digitized copies of the first folio, 20 are in forms that can be downloaded as image files. Only 3 of those, the centers, Cambridge, and New South Wales, include EXIF image metadata like what we just saw. And if you want to play around with the joys of comparing digitized first folios, my catalog of them is online, and I am constantly, exhaustingly updating it. I've been talking about these images as if they are a single thing. This is the center's image of the first folio's Tempest. But any halfway decent imaging lab will always be producing more than one file for an image. I don't mean that it takes multiple shots to get the perfect picture, although it might. I mean that every image has multiple derivatives, and what we see on the outside is only one of those. Here's a digitization expert from the Getty describing that process. We export 4 sets with different recipes for format, size, and compression, and this can take hours. We create a preservation master that includes the color target and frame. That's what we keep in the system in case we need the original again. The modified master is a TIFF with the color target cropped out. The JPEG has the same cropping as the modified master, but is more compressed. And lastly, we export the images as TIFFs, JPEGs, and PDFs made from the TIFFs available for researchers to download online. So we see this as a picture of a page in a book, but open it in a code editor, and what you see are lines and lines and lines of text that to us is meaningless. You can make those lines of code do anything you want them to do. You could rearrange the bytes, and you can rearrange the image. But it also means you should never be too sure of what it is that you're seeing online. This image represents a blank page not photographed. I'm not saying don't trust facsimiles. I'm not saying they're pointless or second best or don't use them or they don't have any research value. What I'm saying is just know what you're looking at. We have taught ourselves through the hard work of bibliographers like W.W. Gregg, whose book this photograph was taken of, how to understand what books are, how they were made by the signs they leave behind. In this case, we're looking at, in this copy of this book, one of the forms was printed over an inner form. And so you've got two, this is not photoshopped in any way. It's just the page got printed, the whole form got printed twice. Can we teach ourselves to do that same thing with facsimiles? What would we learn from I almost said a biographical, but we could do that too. What would we learn from a biographical, a bibliographical, and a cultural materialist approach to studying digital facsimiles? I suspect it would go really well hand in hand with the kind of work that we're doing on the physical books today. I hope we can find out together. Thank you. Man, you're blinded. Come over here.
Yeah, I'm blinded. Well, we're running a little bit late, but I wanted to make sure that we had a couple time for questions, and I know that Sarah would be happy to field some. So if anybody has a question, let me know, and we'll do our best to answer it. Yes.
Yes, I have a question about current and future trends in facsimile. I was wondering what you thought about the field of digital epigraphy and what that can, digital epigraphy and 3D printing and what that might be able to add to the creation of facsimiles in the future.
So the question was about what do I think of digital trends, sort of like where are facsimiles going with new digital technologies. It's definitely going somewhere, and I definitely don't know where it is yet. I think that 3D printing offers so much possibility. I think that we are still thinking of facsimiles as being about reproducing the text. We are not thinking about reproducing the book or reproducing the document or reproducing any of those other sorts of objects. 3D printing, other sorts of digital imaging that would allow us to visualize an object in space and to move it and to rotate it around could give us a whole host of other sort of exciting things to do. I think that bibliographers and librarians don't necessarily spend a lot of time talking with anthropologists and archaeologists, and that's where a lot of that exciting action is happening. So maybe we need to hook up with that a little bit more often. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It sort of took me back my career to, I know this is going to screw with researchers for years. I was in the early ages of preservation microfilming in the late 80s and the early 90s, and we did some microfilming over the Vincent Latin American collection. And the best practice in preservation microfilming was if you were missing a page, you interlibrary loan someone else's book and use their page. And this was best practice across serials and monographs, and now places all that film is not all that film, but a lot of that film is going to be digitized.
Right.
So, and no mention in a target, by the way.
No.
This is a page replace.
So one for repeating for the,
Yeah.
if there is a people on Facebook, hi Facebook. The question was it's sort of like tale of what it was like to be doing preservation microfilming in the 90s, and that best practices then, which always are different than best practices now, was that if you were microfilming a book and it was missing a page or a few pages, what you did was you found another copy of that book, perhaps from another institution. You took images of the missing pages from that book, and then you just stuck them in with your microphone without necessarily noting in the target card, the target file with those of you who have used microfilm at the beginning of every sort of, like item on that microfilm, there's a target card telling you what it is. If you've only experienced it through the joys of EBO or Echo, you are never seeing the target cards, which kind of annoys me for a different story. And with no record of that, and now those microfilms get digitized and they appear in all sorts of places, and bibliographically, that's a mess. They're complete fabrications. And part of me says, that's so fabulous. Like, I probably have this look of sort of like insane joy on my face, because one of the things I like about facsimiles is that they are nuts. And they pretend they're one thing, and they are just, I always say, they're just lying to us. They are lying to us all the time, which is a little unfair. They're not lying to us. We just don't know how to ask the right questions of them, would be, it's like I don't want to hurt their feelings as if like they're alive or something. No, you're not lying, sweetie. Yeah, there are going to be bibliographical issues coming out of that down the line. I'm really sorry, future generations, but we didn't know what we were doing in the past, right? Like, what are you going to do? That's life, I guess. That's excellent.
We have time for about 2 more. Yeah, please.
How can institutions be better about highlighting the labor involved in creating digital facsimiles?
Oh, it's such a good question. Okay, how can institutions be better about highlighting the labor involved in creating digital facsimiles? And it's a really wonderful question, asked maybe by somebody who's been involved in digitizing facsimiles and knows how consuming it is a lot of work. There is maybe if somebody who's tweeting can remember what that blog post is that I think it was Samantha Thompson posted that she wrote a couple years ago about like, why haven't you just digitized everything? And she goes, okay, let me take you through the process. It's so much work. And not even just like the filming stuff, like the matching the filming stuff to the metadata, and then all of and it's not the sort of work that is sexy. It's not the sort of work that gets named, right? So we talk about this was done by the University of Pennsylvania, and we don't say this was done by the University of Pennsylvania, by the dramatically underpaid graduate interns and undergraduates we have working for us from the years, 1980 to 1985. I would like to think that as universities, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate levels, rethink what it means to build a career in the humanities, and that it could mean something other than replicating the careers that generations of humanities professors have had, because those are I'm going for the slightly optimistic version of Sarah now. Those are by and large unavailable to us right now. That attention and that need to build skills outside of the interpretation of documents will perhaps create avenues for highlighting those sorts of work, that sort of work, the labor of digitization as a skill, as opposed to grunt work. And it is too often now treated as grunt work that anybody could do if you just show them what buttons to push. And it's not. It's an intellectual challenge, and it is a skill. There are lots of jobs that are not paid well. I could come up with other sort of academic-related, para-academic jobs that are also underappreciated. I think that it is possible. One of the ways in which things change in that sort of way is funding organizations. So if organizations like Mellon or Clear or NEH start having regulations about one of the reasons that Mellon postdocs are paid so much better than other postdocs is it's a Mellon requirement. So I think if those foundations maybe are a way to go through to start thinking about universities, you need to start recognizing this, and you need to find a way to accommodating that. Because part of then what happens too is when we rely on poorly compensated folks to do the digitization, those folks aren't going to stick around for very long. Maybe that they're just in term limited sort of grant funded things anyway, where you're just doing an internship for a year. But when you have a rapid turnover of people in any sort of job, you all know this, the knowledge it takes to be able to do that work is constantly being lost. And it's not just institutional memory, it is skill and it's disappearing and is having to be constantly rebuilt. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I really hear you on it.
Do one more, please.
That was a long answer too, I'm sorry.
Somebody's got to have one for us.
Like a really fast one.
Facts. Yeah. Okay. You go to the last one.
What's your favorite Shakespeare play?
Oh, God. Oh, what did I ask for a fast question? It changes all of the time, and I have been thinking a lot about, I always think a lot about King Lear. I don't know, that seems like a really not very interesting answer to that question. I wish it was a sort of little obscure play. I love King Lear, but I also really love Titus Andronicus. So maybe I should have gone with Titus. Titus sort of feeds my need for
Objection.
things.
Well, let's thank Sarah for such a great talk.
I was like, I don't know where that was going to end, so I probably forgot saying it.